Я очень рада быть здесь. Я прошу прощения, что я буду говорить должен по-английски. У вас есть моя аннотация по-русски и тоже по-английски. Там написано почти все детали и ссылки, конечно, почему протоиндустриализации нет. Если это вам очень интересно, все детали там. То, что я хочу делать сегодня, это показать вам значение этих терминов, которые очень технические. Я начинала эту работу, я читала дневники помещицы в середине 19 века, и там были эти термины, я совсем не поняла, а словари не помогали мне, потому что эти термины по-английски тоже не поняли совсем. Поэтому в конце концов было нужно просто учиться процесс. И поэтому я хочу показать вам сегодня процесс. И я думаю, что это язык невозможно вообще. Так что во-первых, это вообще непонятно ни в России, ни в Америке, нигде, что такое ткань. Это сделано через процесс weaving, да, ткать. Это вязание, например. Вы видите, что это совсем другая вещь, да? Процесс делать это совсем другая, инструменты совсем другие. И это все лен. Если это шерсть, если это шелк, если это хлопок, совсем по-другому еще. Так что историки, которые написали о протоиндустриализации, даже в Америке, в Великобритании, во Франции, в России, где-нибудь не поняли ничего об этом вообще. И они, конечно, были, идеологические причины, потому они все это писали, я не хочу говорить больше об этом, это в аннотации детали. Но дело не было только идеологии, это было тоже технические понятия, которые не было. Поэтому я вам покажу, во-первых, как красть, how to spin. Вы видите, это очень, конечно, знакомые изображения, да, очень знакомые. Вот spinning wheel, самокрутка, да, и там веретено, spindle. Большинство людей совсем не знают, что такое и какая разница, да. Во-первых, никто не ходит в таком платье и красть, это просто сумасшедший, да. И изображение, где девушки красное веретено, всегда они сидят, тоже никогда не делать это. Самое главное веретено, это делать это, когда ходите, работаете. И сейчас я по-английски, потому что это будет легче для меня. Spindle, веретено. This has been scientifically proven by an anthropologist who studied the productivity of spinners in Peru for 10 years. So this is truly not just from experience, but scientifically proven that a spindle is, as he wrote, Ed Franklin, slower by the hour but faster by the week. All of these historians of proto-industrialization said there are no sign of enough wheels in Russia that they must be backward. They're of course starting from the proposition that Russia was backward, so they don't see a lot of mentions of wheels. Therefore, they're using a simpler tool. This is obviously a very simple tool. It's a stick, right? It's just a stick. You can literally spin yarn with any stick if you know what you're doing. You add a weight to it or thicken the stick a little bit, it spins faster. That's all. You can add 2 more sticks, it'll spin faster still and be heavier. You can make a thicker yarn. That's it. Very simple. Wheel looks more complicated, must be more advanced, must be better, must produce a better product, more product, right? No, totally wrong. That's completely wrong. A spindle can be faster by the week because you can stick it in your belt, you can carry it anywhere, and you can do it while walking, you can do it while doing anything. You can literally be working with one hand, spinning with another hand, and if you're doing it between tasks, alongside tasks all day long, you end up producing a lot more. Also, depending on the fiber, whether you're using linen, yarn, cloth, cotton, shirts, wool, right? Some fibers actually spin require more control and more speed that you can only get with a spindle. A wheel still today can't do that. And the mechanized, fully mechanized, engine-driven machines that we now use to make all of the clothes we're wearing, that can produce very fast right, and a great quantity. They actually still can't do some of the processes that still must be done by hand, including crochet, including some of the fancy linen weaves, still to this day can't be done by machines. And those great machines that have clothed all of us, right, they produce a lesser quality product because they still have less control than you would have spinning. And actually hand spinners, if they want to spend their time doing this, as we no longer want to do, right? But if you learn this when you're 5, as you would have done virtually anyone, boy or girl, through all of time until the 20th century, right? You would be able to do this just in your sleep anytime. You can produce massive amounts, actually. So the industrialization comes to Britain, right? We all know that story. Most of us have probably taught that story, and we may still be teaching it in the usual way. The British example, the first example, right? The canonical example. That example is all about cotton. That's what the British mechanized, starting with the spinning jenny, right? Of course, the famous spinning jenny only worked with cotton. It only works with cotton. So if you want anything in linen or wool, which have other nice qualities, you could not use a spinning jenny. So the spinning jenny works with cotton because cotton has a very, very short staple length, which I understand from the dictionary is glinaskabi. That's, if you pull on it, and I'll hand this around, it's very, very short, right? If you pull on wool, the staple length of wool, glinaskabi, is longer. So maybe 1-2 centimeters. This is, what, centimeters 6 or 7 maybe? Maybe as much as 10, it depends on the breed of wool. And then linen in its fiber form, and I don't unfortunately have loose linen, but this is a little bit that's very badly spun by me. If you knew how to do this when you had 5, it would look much nicer. But a single staple is this long, much, much longer. So just knowing that much, right, you already know that the processes are going to be a little bit different. Cotton needs incredibly fast twist, very, very high-speed twist to hold it together because the staple length is so incredibly short. You have to spin it super, super fast. A machine is good at doing things super, super fast. So that worked well with cotton. However, wool is curlier, it has more elasticity, it holds a lot of air in it, that's what makes it soft and warm. If you spin that on a machine, it goes too fast, and it turns out like a rope. You totally would not want this anywhere near your body if it was machine spun in the way they were doing from the late 18th century into the late 19th century. They only figured out how to get machine spun wool in the 1860s in England, and then everyone borrows it from there, right? So it's really not until the later 19th century that you can get decently spun, machine spun wool. And then linen, whole different problem because the staple length is so long. Linen is kind of rope-like no matter what. So you want to spin it very, very, very thin. And to do that on a machine is also quite difficult, so it takes again until the later 19th century before they can do that. Then, of course, we get into the next step, and we'll come back to that. I have sort of a series of illustrations for whatever I need to, but I'm going to show, the next step is weaving, right? This is a loom, that's the stanok. And these were, by the way, pictures from some of the outdoor museums around Russia, and you can tell exactly which museums understand how weaving works and which ones don't by the samples they put on the machine. These people, and I'm not going to name names of which region each one came from, I left that out on purpose. But this izba loom, right, was put in the museum by people who thought peasant izba, they must do very primitive weaving. And that's exactly what the historians thought, right? No one would ever make this mess on purpose. People who knew how to weave would never do this. They were making things like this. And this, many of us probably have tablecloths like this, right? The beautiful linen, very complex weave. That's what you can do on a peasant loom. The technology of a basic loom, well, first the technology of a spindle goes back as far as human beings go, right? It's just a stick, and anyone can figure out with their fingers playing around with some fiber how to spin it, right? The most basic kinds of looms, the earliest ones are called warp-weighted looms. There's a weight, a heavy stone on the bottom of each thread to hold the warp threads, the ones held taut. And then the weft threads go across it over, under, over, under, over, under. Those go back at least 20,000 years. 20,000 years, right? That basic technology is kind of the same as an izba loom. It's just it's put horizontally, and each warp thread is tied on one end. So you can roll a longer roll, basically, and keep weaving longer. There's a roll at the other end, so you can do a little bit more, but it's a really, really simple difference, technologically speaking. And those very early horizontal looms go back at least a couple thousand years, right? The biggest major technical change, and there's two big ones that come around the end of the 18th century, are the flying shuttle, which is this thing. And what that does is instead of taking a stick with your yarn wrapped around it and pushing it through the loom, and by the way, part of the way the loom is set up, it has other sticks here. It's basically all sticks. Other sticks here that hold every other thread up or down, so you don't have to actually go like this with everyone, like children do, you know? They have a stick holding up every other one, so you just push the stick up, stick your yarn through, your stick down, right? So the major difference with the flying shuttle is instead of by hand pushing your thread through from one side to the other, which means the loom has to be narrow so your arm can go all the way through it. The flying shuttle, you literally throw it. You just go, and it flies out the other end, and you can either grab it or have it sort of set up on a string so that it grabs itself and you send it back the other way. That flying shuttle can be used with this kind of loom, and as they mechanize them more and more, they start to build much wider looms, wider than an arm could ever reach. And a flying shuttle is put on a string and you just sort of set it going and it goes all the way to the other. So that's basically the mechanization of looms, right? The other major thing that you may have talked about in your lectures is the jacquard loom, which was invented by this Frenchman, Jacquard, in the early 19th century. It is the forerunner of computing, actually. The very same punch cards that are our first computers are based on, by Ada Lovelace, based on the punch cards that were the invention of this jacquard to make the very fancy silk patterns, damask silk, right? Fancy silk weaves. That's not actually a complicated machine, and it is not mechanizing the loom. It is used on a basic loom just like peasants in Russia had in their ephod. It's a mechanism added on top that uses punch cards in the same kind of way the sticks are used to just pull one thread or that thread instead of always doing every other one on a stick. The punch cards allow you to pull, lines 3, 12, 6 on the first run, and then totally different ones on the next run, and so on, because you have punch cards instead of sticks. So it's an amazing idea, but technologically speaking, mechanically speaking, there's sort of nothing to it. It's not really mechanized in any sense. There's no engine yet. The British do add the steam engine to the loom eventually by the 1830s, and again, still just for cotton. And it's illegal to borrow British machinery until 1842. The reason it starts to spread mainly to the United States, first to the colonies, is immigrants from England who were managers in factories, engineers themselves, and they took the technology with them, right? But it's not really until 1842 that even the first mechanized cotton loom is starting to spread all over the place, and that's of course when Ivanova is becoming, the Russian Manchester, right? That's all just cotton though. So the question, and how I want to get to my argument about regions here, is I want to get to some examples, and while I'm talking about this, I'm going to pass around the Russian vertino with linen on it, and please feel free to sort of pull on the end and feel what the actual fiber is like, right, as you're touching it, and then compare that with, this is a cotton boll, of course, that's where cotton comes from. Feel how much softer it is, so it can be spun really tight and still stay soft. That's the thing about cotton. And then this is wool, not in its natural state, because that would be really greasy and dirty and smelly and gross. So this is cleaned wool. But feel that also, and touch it and turn it around your fingers. See how the fiber is really very different from the others. While you're doing that, I'm going to show you. Oops, which I wanted for that. Yeah, here. I wanted you to see the microscopic view of the fibers to see how very different they are. That's just the sort of shape of the individual fiber. The extra difference besides that is staple length that I already showed you. And the third major factor is elasticity and curl, which really depends on what you can do with it, right? So basically everything we thought we knew about proto-industrialization, right, is based on cotton. So I just wanted to demonstrate how simple this process is, and a 5-year-old can do it. I don't do it as well as a 5-year-old would have done at any point in time, but so I'll pass this around too, and feel free to play with it. This is just a sample. Give it a try. Okay, so the story of Ivanova as the Russian Manchester, that's fairly familiar, and much of the historiography about industrialization in Russia with textiles starts with Ivanova, but it starts in the late 19th century. And that story, that familiar story, I'm not undermining in any way. The problem with it is what comes right before that, and that's from about 1800 to really 1870, when the assumption was there was something like what was happening in Britain, happening in Russia, but slower, backward, right? And the problem that these historians were writing about, particularly in the 60s and 70s, writing about the problem in Russia, there's not enough wheels. Well, no, the nature of labor in Russia was that it was very mobile and people were doing multiple things. People were multitasking. So they used spindles because they were smart and they knew how to get their productivity to be high, much better than these historians looking on, not understanding the processes knew, right? But the other major factor that makes this very much about locality, about the region, is which kind of fiber. That determines everything else, as I've just shown, right? About what you can make, what kind of fiber. So Ivanova becomes the new Manchester only late in the 19th century when the price of cotton drops. And the whole reasoning behind that, I recommend you read Sven Beckert's very famous book, The Empire of Cotton, about there's a whole global story about the prices of cotton, right? But cotton becomes cheap enough to import. Cotton doesn't grow well in most parts of Russia, although there's parts of Central Asia, but they're mainly importing cotton from China and India, and of course Britain got there first because Britain had colonies, right? So there's nothing inherently sort of more advanced there other than having colonies in the first place. Oh, that's my timer. No, am I on time already? Yeah! Super quick, my 3 examples. So sorry. So Ivanova continues to produce linen and wool, and that has been forgotten and left out of all of the stories as backward and only something peasants do in their huts. That linen and wool was exported around the world, fetched good prices, was high quality, especially actually when made in peasant huts, because a peasant working more slowly in their hut puts actually more time into those very fancy weaves. The tablecloths you can now buy everywhere. They're machine made now, but those were that whole process. So that only ends in Ivanova. Ivanova becomes just the Russian Manchester, mainly producing sitits, right, printed cotton, only when serfdom ends, emancipation. And so we no longer have peasants working for obrok, basically, and doing the weaving for obrok payments. That's the big change there. Moscow has the silk industry, and the silk industry goes way earlier. It begins in like 17th century. They start using the jacquard looms and producing absolutely top-notch silks at the same time the French are doing, not on the same scale. It happens in Moscow, specifically Moscow, because foreigners and the center of commerce, right? You put those 2 things together, and actually the same thing was true of knitting, which begins in Moscow in the 16th century. Peter the Great brought it for the army. Knitting has a very, very simple machine that can make only a straight, plain knit, which was useful for stockings. But alongside it, and continuously right up until actually World War II, there were hand knitting centers that made gloves, which are fancier and harder. You can imagine 5 fingers, right? You can't do that with a machine. Hand knitting centers existed actually all over the empire. I have a list in my annotatia, I think. There were at least 6 or 7 major ones, including Veliki Novgorod, Yaroslavl, Vladimir. There were these knitting that are exactly the putting out system of the British type, except from 16th, 17th century all the way to the 20th, right? And then my last example, Orenburg, very quickly, I know I have to finish. You all know Orenburg shawls, right? The crucial thing about these, the fact that they happen in Orenburg, the wool comes from Orenburg goats, which are basically cashmere, but even in the 18th century they couldn't call them cashmere. They were marketing them as Orenburg down. And 2 people named Pyotr and Yelena Rychkov basically invented the idea of branding independently. And they used the idea that the technology, and we don't even know if this is true, but the designs, the way it's spun, the using the goat down, all of that was taken from nomads, exoticizing it, right? This is the height of Orientalism. When it becomes marketed around the world. But they initially come up with the ideas in the late 18th century and bring it to exhibitions around the world to sell it as the Orenburg shawl. And the reason it should earn money is not just that it's gorgeous handwork, but that it's from Orenburg. It's got this nomadic kind of, exoticism to it. And so it sold incredibly well around the world at the height of Victorian heyday. When that kind of Orientalism passed as a fad, the Orenburg shawl had more trouble getting marketed. So it continues. There's a whole long story what's happened to it since I don't have time for it, but sorry.
Oh, you've done